Sarah Chen had always known she wanted to save lives, not take them. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, she watched her grandmother struggle with diabetes and heart problems. The local doctors and nurses became her heroes, working tirelessly to keep her grandmother comfortable and alive for as long as possible. When her grandmother finally passed away when Sarah was 16, she made a promise at the funeral that would shape her entire future. "I'm going to become a medic," she whispered to her mother that day, tears streaming down her face. "I want to help people the way those doctors helped Grandma." Her mother smiled through her own tears and squeezed Sarah's hand. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you, sweetheart." After high school, Sarah faced a difficult choice. College was expensive and her family didn't have much money. Her father worked at the local factory, and her mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. The military offered a solution that seemed perfect for her situation. She could serve her country, get training as a combat medic, and earn money for college all at the same time. The day she walked into the Army recruitment office, Sergeant Martinez looked her up and down with a skeptical expression. Sarah was barely 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed maybe 120 pounds soaking wet. She had long black hair that she kept in a neat ponytail and wore glasses that made her look more like a librarian than a soldier. "You sure about this, kid?" Sergeant Martinez asked, leaning back in his chair. "Military life isn't easy, especially for women. And being a medic in a combat zone, well, that's a whole different level of tough." Sarah straightened her shoulders and looked him directly in the eye. "I'm sure, Sergeant. I want to help people, and I'm not afraid of hard work." Something in her voice must have convinced him because he slid the paperwork across the desk. "All right then. Let's see what you're made of." Basic training was harder than anything Sarah had ever experienced. The drill sergeants yelled at her constantly, questioning whether someone so small and quiet could handle the pressure of military life. During physical training, she struggled to keep up with the larger, stronger recruits. Her hands would blister from doing push-ups and her legs would shake during long runs. But every time she wanted to quit, she thought about her grandmother and the promise she had made. "Chen, you're falling behind again," Drill Sergeant Thompson would shout. "What are you going to do when someone's life depends on you moving fast?" "I'll find a way, Drill Sergeant," Sarah would reply, pushing herself harder than she thought possible. It was during a particularly brutal training exercise that Sarah first proved herself to her fellow recruits. They were practicing combat scenarios in the middle of the night when Private Rodriguez twisted his ankle badly in a hole. The injury was serious enough that he couldn't walk, and they were miles from base camp. While the other recruits stood around arguing about what to do, Sarah immediately dropped to her knees beside Rodriguez. She had been studying first aid manuals every night, memorizing every technique and procedure she could find. Her hands moved quickly and confidently as she examined the injury, feeling for broken bones and checking circulation. "It's not broken, but it's a bad sprain," she announced to the group. "We need to immobilize it and get him back to base." Using materials from their pack, Sarah created a makeshift splint and bandage system that would allow Rodriguez to be carried safely. She organized the other recruits into a rotation system, so they could take turns helping him back to camp. Her calm, professional demeanor in a crisis situation impressed everyone, including the drill sergeants who had been secretly watching the exercise. From that night forward, Sarah earned a new level of respect from her fellow recruits. They started coming to her with questions about first aid and medical procedures. She began teaching informal classes in the barracks, sharing everything she was learning about emergency medicine. When it came time to choose specializations, Sarah's path was clear. She excelled in all her medical training courses, showing a natural ability to stay calm under pressure and make quick, accurate decisions. Her instructors noticed that she had an unusual combination of technical skill and genuine compassion that made her an exceptional medic. During advanced medical training, Sarah learned to treat everything from minor cuts and bruises to life-threatening gunshot wounds. She practiced on mannequins and cadavers, but she knew the real test would come when she had to work on actual human beings who were injured and scared. The training was intense and sometimes disturbing. She learned to stop bleeding quickly, insert breathing tubes, give injections under pressure, and make split-second decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help. The instructors constantly reminded the medic trainees about their primary mission. "Your job is to save lives, not take them," Master Sergeant Williams would repeat during every class. "You carry medical supplies, not extra ammunition." You treat the wounded, you don't engage the enemy. Medics don't fight. That's not what we do. Sarah took these words to heart. She had joined the military to help people, not to hurt them. The idea of pointing a weapon at another human being made her uncomfortable. She was much more interested in learning about new medical techniques and studying anatomy than she was in weapons training. Her weapon qualification scores were adequate, but not impressive. She could hit a target when she needed to, but her heart wasn't in it. Her superiors didn't seem concerned about this. After all, medics were supposed to focus on healing, not fighting. As graduation from medical training approached, Sarah felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. She had proven herself capable of handling medical emergencies, working under pressure and earning the trust of her fellow soldiers. She believed she understood her role clearly: save lives, treat the wounded, and stay out of combat situations. What Sarah didn't know was that the neat, orderly world of military training was about to collide with the chaotic, unpredictable reality of actual combat. The rules and procedures she had memorized so carefully would soon be tested in ways she never could have imagined. And the simple directive that medics don't fight would prove to be much more complicated than anyone had told her. Her deployment. Orders came through on a Tuesday morning in March. She was being sent to Afghanistan as part of a forward operating base medical team. Her job would be to provide medical support for patrol missions and treat wounded soldiers in the field. As she packed her medical supplies and said goodbye to her family, Sarah felt confident and prepared. She had no idea that in just a few months, everything she believed about being a medic would be turned upside down. The heat hit Sarah like a physical blow when she stepped off the transport plane at Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan. Even at 6 a.m, the temperature was already climbing toward what would be another scorching day. The dust seemed to get into everything immediately, coating her uniform and equipment with a fine layer of grit that she would soon learn was just a permanent part of life in this place. Forward operating base Thunder was smaller than she had expected. Surrounded by concrete walls topped with razor wire, it felt more like a fortress than a medical facility. The buildings were mostly prefabricated structures and shipping containers that had been converted into living and working spaces. Everything was painted in desert camouflage colors that made the base blend into the harsh landscape around it. Sarah was assigned to a small medical team led by Captain Williams, a gruff but experienced Army doctor who had already completed 2 tours in Iraq. The team also included Sergeant Mike Thompson, a veteran medic with over 10 years of experience, and Corpsman Davis, a Navy medic who had volunteered for Army duty to get more combat experience. "Welcome to paradise, Chen," Sergeant Thompson said with a dry laugh as he showed her around the medical facility. "Hope you like the heat because it's going to be over 120 degrees most days for the next few months." The medical facility was well equipped, but cramped. They had everything needed to handle trauma cases, including a small operating room and recovery area. Most of their work involved treating routine injuries and illnesses among the base personnel, but they also served as the primary medical support for patrol missions in the surrounding area. Captain Williams was direct and no-nonsense during Sarah's first briefing. "Your job here is simple, Chen. Keep our people alive and healthy. Most of what you'll see will be routine stuff. Heat exhaustion, minor injuries, stomach problems from the local food. But when the patrols go out, things can get serious fast." He pointed to a map of the local area covered with pins and markings. "The Taliban are active in this region. IEDs are the biggest threat, but we also deal with sniper attacks and occasional direct assaults. When casualties come in, every second counts." Sarah nodded, feeling both nervous and excited. This was what she had trained for, the reason she had joined the military. "I understand, sir. I'm ready." Her first few weeks at the base were relatively quiet. She treated soldiers for heat-related illnesses, food poisoning, and minor injuries from training exercises. She quickly learned the rhythms of life at the forward operating base. Days started before dawn to take advantage of the cooler temperatures. Most outdoor activities happened in the early morning or evening. During the hottest part of the day, everyone tried to stay in air-conditioned spaces when possible. Sarah found herself adapting to the environment faster than she had expected. The other medics on her team were experienced and professional, and they took time to teach her the specific challenges of providing medical care in a combat zone. They showed her how to set up a field medical station quickly, how to triage multiple casualties efficiently, and how to work effectively while wearing full body armor and carrying heavy equipment. The biggest difference between this and stateside medicine, Sergeant Thompson explained during one of their training sessions, is that everything here happens under pressure. You might be treating someone while mortars are landing nearby, or you might have to make life or death decisions with limited supplies and no backup. Sarah absorbed everything they taught her, but she still felt confident about her role. She was there to heal, not to fight. Her weapons stayed locked in the armory most of the time, and she focused on perfecting her medical skills. The first real test came on a Tuesday morning in May. A patrol had been hit by an IED about 10 miles from the base, and they were bringing in casualties by helicopter. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she heard the distinctive sound of the medevac chopper approaching the landing zone. 2 wounded, 1 critical, came the radio report from the helicopter crew. ETA 2 minutes. Sarah and the medical team rushed to the landing zone, their equipment ready. As the helicopter touched down, Sarah got her first real look at combat casualties. The critical patient was a young soldier, probably not much older than herself, with severe leg injuries from the blast. Blood had soaked through the field dressings and he was barely conscious. "Let's move," Captain Williams shouted over the noise of the helicopter. "Chen, you're with me on the critical case." Everything Sarah had learned in training kicked in automatically. She helped load the wounded soldier onto a stretcher and began working to stabilize his vital signs while they rushed toward the medical facility. Her hands moved quickly and confidently, checking pulse, blood pressure, and breathing while Captain Williams assessed the injuries. In the operating room, Sarah assisted as Captain Williams worked to save the soldier's leg. The injuries were severe, with significant damage to bone and soft tissue, but they managed to control the bleeding and stabilize the patient for evacuation to a larger medical facility. The second patient had less serious injuries, shrapnel wounds to his arm and shoulder that required cleaning and stitching, but weren't life-threatening. Sarah treated these wounds herself, working carefully to remove all the debris and foreign material while the soldier told her about the attack. "It came out of nowhere," he said, wincing as she cleaned the wounds. "We were just driving along, and then there was this huge explosion. I thought we were all dead for sure." "You're going to be fine," Sarah assured him, applying fresh bandages. "These wounds look worse than they are. You'll be back with your unit in a few weeks." When both patients had been stabilized and prepared for evacuation, Sarah finally had a chance to catch her breath. Her hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but she felt proud of how she had performed under pressure. She had done exactly what she was trained to do: save lives and treat the wounded. Captain Williams found her cleaning up the operating room later that evening. "Good work today, Chen. You handled yourself well under pressure." "Thank you, sir. I just did what you taught me." "That's exactly right. Remember, that's our job out here. We fix people up and send them home. We stay focused on the medical mission and let the combat troops handle the fighting." Over the next several weeks, Sarah treated dozens of casualties from various incidents around the region. Some were serious trauma cases that required immediate surgery. Others were minor injuries that just needed basic first aid and observation. Each case taught her something new about combat medicine and helped build her confidence. She began to feel like a veteran herself, capable of handling whatever medical emergencies came through the door. The other members of her team treated her as an equal, and she had earned the respect of the combat troops who knew she would be there to help them if they got hurt. But Sarah was about to learn that in a war zone, the line between medical personnel and combat troops wasn't always as clear as she had been taught. The enemy didn't always respect the Geneva Convention rules about medical personnel being non-combatants, and sometimes circumstances would force even medics to make choices they never thought they would have to make. By July, Sarah had settled into a routine at Forward Operating Base Thunder. The scorching heat of the Afghan summer had become just another part of daily life, along with the constant dust, the smell of diesel fuel, and the ever-present tension of knowing that danger could strike at any moment. She had treated over 50 casualties in the past 2 months, ranging from minor injuries to life-threatening trauma cases. The base commander, Colonel Peterson, had been impressed with the medical team's performance and had started requesting their support for more complex missions. Instead of just waiting at the base for casualties to arrive, they were now being asked to accompany certain patrols to provide immediate medical support in the field. "We're changing tactics," Captain Williams explained during a team briefing. "Intelligence indicates that the Taliban are getting more aggressive in their attacks. They're using more sophisticated IEDs and coordinating ambush attacks. Command wants us closer to the action so we can provide immediate care. Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness about this development. Field medicine would be more challenging than working in their well-equipped medical facility, but it also meant she could help wounded soldiers faster, potentially saving lives that might be lost during the time it took to transport casualties back to base. What exactly does that mean for us? She asked. It means we go out with the patrols, Sergeant Thompson replied. We set up mobile aid stations, provide immediate trauma care, and stabilize patients for evacuation. It's more dangerous, but it's also where we can do the most good. Captain Williams nodded. Chen, you'll be going out with Bravo Squad tomorrow. It's a routine patrol through some villages about 15 miles northeast of here. Should be pretty straightforward. Sarah spent the evening preparing her field medical kit and reviewing trauma procedures. She packed extra bandages, pain medication, IV fluids, and all the supplies she might need to treat serious injuries without access to the main medical facility. Her equipment weighed almost 40 pounds, but she had trained extensively with heavy loads and felt confident she could handle it. The patrol consisted of 12 soldiers led by Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a tough, experienced, non-commissioned officer who had already completed 3 tours in Afghanistan. The mission was to visit several villages, gather intelligence about Taliban activity in the area, and show a presence to discourage insurgent operations. Stick close to the squad, Doc, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez told Sarah as they prepared to leave the base. If shooting starts, get behind cover and wait for us to secure the area. Don't try to be a hero. Sarah nodded, adjusting the straps on her heavy medical pack. I understand, Sergeant. I'm here to treat casualties, not fight. The patrol moved out just before dawn, taking advantage of the cooler morning temperatures. They traveled in 2 armored vehicles designed to protect against IED attacks. Sarah rode in the second vehicle with half the squad, her medical equipment secured beside her. The landscape outside the base was harsh and desolate. Rocky hills covered with sparse vegetation stretched to the horizon in every direction. Occasional patches of green marked villages where local farmers managed to grow crops despite the difficult conditions. The roads were rough and dusty, and Sarah found herself bouncing around despite the vehicle's heavy suspension. Their first stop was a village called Kadir, home to about 300 people who made their living farming and raising goats. The villagers seemed friendly enough, though Sarah noticed that many of the men watched the American soldiers with suspicious expressions. The patrol leader met with the village elder while the other soldiers provided security, and Sarah set up a small medical station. Within minutes, villagers began bringing children and elderly people to see her. Most of the problems were minor: cuts, bruises, infections, and chronic conditions that had been going untreated. Sarah worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning wounds, distributing basic medications, and providing health education to parents about caring for their children. Thank you, miss, an elderly woman said in broken English after Sarah had treated an infected cut on her grandson's foot. You are very kind. Sarah smiled and nodded, feeling good about the work she was doing. This was exactly why she had become a medic, to help people who needed medical care. The patrol visited 2 more villages that morning without incident. At each stop, Sarah treated a variety of minor medical problems while the soldiers gathered intelligence and interacted with local residents. It seemed like a successful mission that was building positive relationships between the American forces and the local population. But Sarah was beginning to notice subtle signs that something wasn't quite right. In each village, she observed that most of the young men were absent. The village elders gave vague explanations about them being away working or visiting relatives, but Sarah could tell that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and the other soldiers were becoming increasingly suspicious. Something's not right here, Doc, Private Martinez whispered to Sarah as they prepared to leave the 3rd village. Where are all the fighting-age males? This doesn't feel normal. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez called the patrol together before they moved to their final destination. Stay alert, everyone. I don't like the pattern we're seeing. Keep your weapons ready and watch for anything unusual. The final village on their route was called Shinwar, slightly larger than the others with about 400 residents. As their vehicles approached the outskirts, Sarah noticed that this village seemed almost completely deserted. No children playing in the streets, no women hanging laundry, no elderly men sitting in the shade talking. This is definitely not normal, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez said into his radio. The whole place looks empty. But they had their orders to visit all 4 villages, so the patrol continued forward. As they reached the center of the village, a few residents appeared, but something about their behavior seemed forced and unnatural. The village elder who met with the patrol leader seemed nervous and kept looking around as if he was expecting something to happen. Sarah set up her medical station in the village square, but for the first time all day, no one came seeking medical care. That was highly unusual, since she had been overwhelmed with patients at every other stop. The silence and emptiness of the village made her increasingly uncomfortable. "Sergeant," she called quietly to Rodriguez, "this doesn't feel right. No one wants medical care, and I don't see any women or children anywhere." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "I know, Doc. We're going to wrap this up quick and get out of here." But as he spoke those words, Sarah heard a sound that made her blood run cold, the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. Her training kicked in immediately, and she dove for cover behind a low stone wall just as the first explosions rocked the village square. The ambush had begun, and Sarah was about to discover that the neat distinction between medics and combat soldiers wasn't going to protect her from what was coming next. The mortar explosion shattered the morning quiet of Shinwar village like thunder. Sarah pressed herself against the stone wall as debris rained down around her, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over the ringing in her ears. The carefully organized medical supplies she had set up moments earlier were now scattered across the dusty ground, some packages torn open by shrapnel. "Ambush, take cover!" Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's voice cut through the chaos over the radio. "We've got incoming from multiple directions." As the initial mortar barrage ended, automatic weapons fire erupted from several buildings around the village square. Sarah could hear the distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles mixed with the heavier sound of machine gun fire. The Taliban fighters had chosen their position well, surrounding the patrol on three sides with the Americans caught in an open area with limited cover. "Doc, you okay?" Private Martinez called from behind a nearby building where several squad members had taken position. "I'm fine," Sarah shouted back, though her voice was shaking. She grabbed her medical pack and crawled toward better cover, staying low as bullets snapped overhead. This was nothing like the training exercises she had participated in. The noise was overwhelming. The smell of gunpowder and dust filled her nostrils, and the very real possibility of death hung in the air like a physical presence. She had never been so terrified in her life. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was moving between his soldiers, coordinating their response to the attack. Sarah could see him speaking rapidly into his radio, calling for backup and air support while trying to assess their tactical situation. The patrol was outnumbered and surrounded, but they were well-trained and experienced. "Peterson Williams, lay down, suppressing fire on that building," Rodriguez commanded. "Martinez, Chen, get to the vehicles and see if you can establish radio contact with base." Sarah forced herself to move, running in a low crouch toward the armored vehicles while bullets kicked up dust around her feet. The 50 yards to the vehicles felt like 50 miles, but she made it without getting hit. Private Martinez was already there, trying to get the radio working. "The antenna got hit by shrapnel," he reported grimly. "I can't raise base." Sarah looked around desperately for wounded soldiers who might need medical attention. So far, the squad had been lucky. The mortar attack had been inaccurate, and the small arms fire hadn't found any targets yet. But she knew that luck wouldn't last forever. As if responding to her thoughts, she heard a scream of pain from across the square. Private Johnson had been hit and was down behind a low wall, clutching his shoulder while blood seeped between his fingers. "Johnson's hit," someone shouted. "Doc, we need you over here." Sarah grabbed her medical pack and started to run toward the wounded soldier, but Martinez caught her arm. "Doc, you can't go out there. There's too much fire." "He's wounded," Sarah protested. "That's what I'm here for. You'll get yourself killed and then you won't be able to help anybody." Sarah knew Martinez was right, but every instinct she had developed as a medic was screaming at her to help the wounded soldier. She could see Johnson about 30 yards away, still conscious but clearly in pain and losing blood. Other squad members were trying to provide cover, but the enemy fire was too intense to attempt a rescue. "We need to suppress that machine gun position," Staff Sergeant Rodriguez shouted into his radio. "It's got the whole square covered." The machine gun he was referring to was positioned in a 2-story building overlooking the village square. From that elevated position, the Taliban gunner could see almost everything and was preventing any movement by the patrol. Every time someone tried to move to help Johnson or improve their position, a burst of machine gun fire forced them back into cover. Sarah studied the tactical situation with growing frustration. As a medic, she had been trained to focus on treating casualties, not fighting enemies. But she could see that unless someone dealt with that machine gun position, Private Johnson was going to bleed to death before anyone could reach him. The firefight continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Sarah watched helplessly as Johnson's movements became weaker, and his calls for help became fainter. His fellow soldiers were doing everything they could to reach him, but the machine gun position made it impossible. Then she heard the sound that changed everything. The distinctive whine of incoming RPGs. The rocket-propelled grenades exploded near the patrol's vehicles, and Sarah felt the concussion wave knock her backward. When she looked up, she saw that Private Martinez had been hit by shrapnel and was bleeding from multiple wounds on his legs and arms. "Martinez is down," she called, immediately moving to treat him. This casualty was close enough that she could reach him safely, and she began working to stop the bleeding and assess his injuries. "It's not too bad, Doc," Martinez said through gritted teeth. "Just a bunch of little pieces of metal, but my rifle got damaged in the blast." Sarah looked at the twisted remains of Martinez's M4 rifle and felt a chill run down her spine. If the situation got worse, they would be one weapon short in defending themselves. As she worked on Martinez's wounds, Sarah could hear Staff Sergeant Rodriguez trying to coordinate with other squad members. The radio was still not working properly, so there was no way to call for backup or air support. They were on their own until someone back at base realized they were overdue and sent help. "How many rounds do we have left?" Rodriguez called to his soldiers. "I'm down to 2 magazines, came one reply. "Same here," called another. "1 magazine plus what's in the rifle," reported a third. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized the patrol was running low on ammunition. If the fight continued much longer, they might not have enough bullets to defend themselves. And Private Johnson was still lying wounded and exposed in the middle of the square, growing weaker by the minute. It was then that Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The machine gun position that had been keeping them pinned down had gone quiet. At first she thought maybe the gunner had been hit, but then she saw movement in the windows of other buildings around the square. The Taliban fighters were moving, preparing to change their tactics. Instead of just keeping the patrol pinned down with long-range fire, they were getting ready to assault the Americans' positions directly. Sarah could see armed figures moving between buildings, working their way closer to where the patrol had taken cover. "Sergeant," she called to Rodriguez. "They're moving. I think they're going to try to overrun our positions." Rodriguez looked where she was pointing and cursed under his breath. He had reached the same conclusion. With their ammunition running low and no way to call for help, the patrol was in serious danger of being overwhelmed by superior numbers. That was when Sarah realized that all her training about medics not fighting was about to become irrelevant. In the next few minutes, her choice might not be between healing and fighting. It might be between fighting and dying. The Taliban fighters moved with practiced coordination, using the buildings and walls of Shinwar village to advance closer to the surrounded patrol. Sarah watched in growing horror as armed figures appeared in doorways and windows, their AK-47 rifles glinting in the harsh Afghan sunlight. The net was closing around them, and she could see the determination in Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's face as he realized their desperate situation. "Listen up," Rodriguez called to his remaining soldiers. "They're going to try to rush us. Conserve your ammo and make every shot count. If anyone gets overrun, fall back to the vehicles and we'll make our stand there." Sarah finished bandaging Martinez's wounds and helped him move to a better position behind the damaged vehicle. His injuries weren't life-threatening, but he was in no condition to fight effectively. That left only 10 fully capable soldiers to defend against what appeared to be at least 20 Taliban fighters. "Doc, you need to stay with the vehicles," Rodriguez told her firmly. "If this goes bad, you're our only hope of treating casualties." Sarah nodded, but her eyes kept drifting to Private Johnson, who was still lying exposed in the village square. His calls for help had stopped, and she could see that his movements were becoming weaker. The blood pooling around him had grown larger, and she knew he didn't have much time left. "Sergeant, we have to do something about Johnson," she said urgently. "He's going to die if we don't get to him soon." "I know, Doc, but there's nothing we can do right now. That machine gun position is still active, and if we try to reach him, we'll just create more casualties." As if to prove his point, the machine gun opened fire again, sending a stream of bullets across the square. The gunner was clearly still alive and still had plenty of ammunition. Any attempt to rescue Johnson would be suicide. Sarah felt helpless and frustrated. Everything she had been trained for, everything she believed about her role as a medic was being rendered meaningless by the tactical situation. She was supposed to treat the wounded, but the wounded soldier was unreachable. She was supposed to save lives, but all she could do was watch helplessly while a young man bled to death. The Taliban assault began with a coordinated attack from 3 directions. Fighters emerged from buildings on the north, east, and south sides of the square, moving in short rushes from cover to cover while laying down suppressing fire. The Americans responded with disciplined, accurate shooting, but they were quickly burning through their limited ammunition. 2 more magazines? Called Specialist Peterson from the north side of their perimeter. 1 magazine left. Came another report. Sarah watched the ammunition count dropping and felt panic rising in her chest. When the soldiers ran out of bullets, the Taliban would simply overwhelm their positions through sheer numbers. She thought about her family back in Ohio, about the promise she had made at her grandmother's funeral, about all the wounded soldiers she would never get a chance to help. That was when she remembered something that might change their situation. Martinez's damaged rifle was still lying where it had fallen after the RPG attack. The weapon itself was twisted and unusable, but the ammunition magazines might still be intact. Staying low, Sarah crawled over to examine the damaged rifle. The magazines were scratched and dented but appeared to be functional. She grabbed them and started distributing the extra ammunition to soldiers who were running low. "Doc, where did you find these?" asked Specialist Peterson gratefully, as she handed him 2 fresh magazines. "Martinez's rifle got destroyed, but the ammo was still good," Sarah replied. The extra ammunition helped, but Sarah could see that it was only a temporary solution. The Taliban had more fighters and more bullets, and they seemed willing to accept casualties to overrun the American position. Several enemy fighters had already been hit, but more kept appearing to take their places. It was then that Sarah noticed something that changed everything. The machine gun position that had been keeping them pinned down was in a building that appeared to have been abandoned hastily. She could see household items scattered around, including what looked like medical supplies and equipment. More importantly, she realized that the building had a back entrance that might not be covered by enemy fire. "Sergeant!" she called to Rodriguez during a brief lull in the shooting. "That machine gun position, I think I can get to it from behind." Rodriguez looked where she was pointing and shook his head immediately. "Absolutely not, Doc. That's not your job. You're a medic, not an assault trooper." "But look at the tactical situation," Sarah pressed. "That machine gun is what's keeping us pinned down and preventing us from helping Johnson. If someone can take it out, the whole dynamic changes." I said no. "Chen, we can't risk losing our medic." Sarah understood Rodriguez's reasoning, but she also understood that if something didn't change soon, they were all going to die anyway. The Taliban fighters were getting closer with each assault, and the patrol's ammunition was nearly exhausted. Traditional military tactics weren't going to save them. Another wave of enemy fighters advanced across the square, and this time they got much closer before being driven back. Sarah could hear Rodriguez and his soldiers coordinating their defense, but she could also hear the worry in their voices. They were professionals who had been in many firefights, and they knew when a situation was becoming hopeless. That was when Sarah made a decision that went against everything she had been taught about her role as a medic. She couldn't stand by and watch her fellow soldiers die when there might be something she could do to help them. The machine gun position had to be neutralized, and she was the only one in a position to attempt it. While Rodriguez was focused on coordinating the defense, Sarah quietly gathered what she would need. She picked up Martinez's sidearm, a 9mm pistol that had survived the RPG blast undamaged. She also grabbed 2 fragmentation grenades from the equipment scattered around the damaged vehicle. She had never thrown a grenade in combat before, had never fired a pistol at another human being, had never even considered the possibility that she might have to kill someone. But as she looked at Private Johnson lying motionless in the square and listened to the Taliban fighters getting closer to overrunning their position, she knew that her choice was clear. Sometimes medics did have to fight. Sarah took a deep breath, checked to make sure the pistol was loaded and ready, and started moving toward the back of the building that housed the machine gun position. She was about to discover whether her medical training had prepared her for the split-second decisions and life-or-death actions that combat required. Behind her, she could hear the battle intensifying as the Taliban fighters launched what sounded like their final assault. In a few minutes, it would all be over one way or another. Sarah moved through the shadows between buildings, her heart pounding and her hands shaking, carrying weapons instead of medical supplies for the first time in her military career. Everything was about to change. Sarah moved through the narrow alleyways behind the buildings of Shinwar village, her medical training helping her stay calm, despite the terror coursing through her body. Every skill she had learned about working under pressure, about making quick decisions in life or death situations, about staying focused when everything around her was chaos, now served her in a way she had never imagined. The sound of gunfire grew louder as she approached the building housing the machine gun position. She could hear the distinctive rhythm of the enemy weapon firing in controlled bursts, each burst potentially killing one of her fellow soldiers. Between the weapon's firing cycles, she could hear Rodriguez shouting orders and the crack of American rifles responding to the Taliban assault. The back of the building was exactly as she had observed from a distance, unguarded and accessible. The Taliban fighters had positioned themselves to defend against an attack from the front, but hadn't considered the possibility of someone approaching from behind. Sarah pressed herself against the wall and listened carefully, trying to determine how many enemy fighters were inside. She could hear at least two voices speaking in Pashto, the local language. One voice was giving orders while the other seemed to be feeding ammunition to the machine gun. From the sound patterns, she estimated there were probably 2 or 3 fighters in the building, with at least one dedicated machine gunner and 1 or more assistants. Sarah checked the pistol one more time, making sure the safety was off and a round was chambered. She had qualified with this weapon during training, but shooting at paper targets on a firing range was completely different from what she was about to do. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she forced herself to take slow, deep breaths to steady her nerves. The first grenade would have to be perfect. She would get only one chance at surprise, and if she missed or if the grenade didn't detonate properly, the enemy fighters would know she was there and would turn their weapons on her. Sarah pulled the pin from the first grenade, held the safety lever down and prepared to throw it through the window. Just as she was about to make her move, she heard something that made her blood run cold. From the direction of the village square came the sound of American voices shouting in panic and pain. The Taliban assault was succeeding, and her fellow soldiers were being overrun. "Fall back to the vehicles," she heard Rodriguez shout. "They're breaking through!" Sarah knew she was out of time. If she didn't act immediately, the machine gun position would continue to dominate the battlefield and her friends would all be killed. She said a quick prayer, released the safety lever on the grenade, counted to 3 and threw it through the window with all her strength. The explosion was deafening in the confined space of the building. Sarah immediately heard screaming from inside, followed by the sound of the machine gun falling silent. She didn't wait to assess the damage, but immediately threw the second grenade through a different window, to ensure that any surviving enemy fighters would be neutralized. The second explosion brought down part of the building's roof, and Sarah could see dust and debris pouring from the windows. The machine gun position was definitely out of action, but she needed to make sure there were no surviving fighters who could reactivate it. This was the moment she had to cross the line she had never thought she would cross. Sarah drew the pistol and entered the building through the back door, ready to shoot any enemy fighters who might still be alive and dangerous. The scene inside was devastating. The first grenade had killed one Taliban fighter instantly and severely wounded another. The machine gunner was still alive but badly injured, his right arm hanging at an unnatural angle and blood streaming from wounds on his face and chest. When he saw Sarah enter with the pistol, he tried to reach for an AK-47 rifle lying nearby. Sarah had less than a second to decide. The wounded fighter was reaching for a weapon that could kill her and then be turned on her fellow soldiers. Every principle she had learned about medical ethics said she should treat his wounds and try to save his life. But every principle of survival and loyalty to her unit said she had to stop him from reaching that rifle. The pistol felt impossibly heavy in her hands as she pointed it at another human being for the first time in her life. The Taliban fighter's eyes met hers across the dusty, debris-filled room, and for a moment time seemed to freeze. He was probably not much older than she was, maybe someone's son or brother, maybe someone who had joined the fight for reasons he believed were justified. But he was also reaching for a weapon that would be used to kill American soldiers, her friends, her patients, people she had sworn to protect and care for. Sarah pulled the trigger 3 times in quick succession. The sound was shockingly loud in the enclosed space, and the muzzle flash seemed to light up the entire room. The Taliban fighter stopped reaching for the rifle and slumped backward against the wall, his eyes going blank. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen, staring at what she had done. The person who had entered this building was a medic dedicated to saving lives. The person standing here now was a soldier who had just killed an enemy fighter. She wasn't sure how to reconcile those two identities, or even if it was possible. But there was no time for reflection. Outside, the battle was still raging, and she could hear her fellow soldiers fighting desperately to survive. The machine gun position was neutralized, but she needed to get back and help treat the wounded. Sarah holstered the pistol and ran back toward the village square, where she found that the tactical situation had changed dramatically. With the machine gun silenced, Rodriguez and his soldiers had been able to move to better positions and were now holding off the Taliban assault more effectively. But there were casualties that needed immediate attention. "Doc, thank God," called Specialist Peterson when he saw her approaching. "We've got 2 wounded over here." Sarah immediately shifted back into medic mode, grabbing her medical supplies and rushing to treat the injured soldiers. One had taken a bullet through the shoulder that had missed major arteries, but required immediate attention to prevent infection. The other had shrapnel wounds from a grenade explosion that needed cleaning and bandaging. As she worked on the wounded soldiers, Sarah could hear the Taliban fighters beginning to withdraw. Without their machine gun position to provide cover and suppressing fire, they couldn't maintain their assault against the disciplined American defensive fire. The sound of gunfire was becoming more sporadic as the enemy fighters fell back to positions farther from the village square. "Doc, what happened to that machine gun?" Rodriguez asked as he came over to check on the casualties. "It just went silent all of a sudden." Sarah looked up from bandaging the shrapnel wounds and met his eyes. "I took care of it, Sergeant." Rodriguez stared at her for a moment, taking in her dust-covered uniform, the smell of gunpowder on her clothes, and the empty grenade pins still attached to her equipment vest. "You took care of it? Doc, please tell me you didn't do what I think you did." "The machine gun position is neutralized," Sarah said simply, returning her attention to treating the wounded soldier. "That's all that matters right now." But even as she spoke those words, Sarah knew that everything had changed. She was still a medic, still dedicated to saving lives and treating the wounded, but she was also now a soldier who had killed in combat, who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The person who had woken up that morning believing that medics don't fight no longer existed. The sound of approaching helicopters broke through the diminishing gunfire as the medevac and reinforcement units finally arrived at Chinwar village. Sarah looked up from treating Private Johnson, who had miraculously survived his wounds despite lying exposed in the village square for over an hour. The tourniquets and pressure bandages she had applied immediately after neutralizing the machine gun position had saved his life, but he needed surgery urgently. "Hang in there, Johnson," she told him as she prepared him for evacuation. "You're going to make it home." The young soldier managed a weak smile. "Thanks, Doc. I heard what you did with that machine gun. You saved all of us." Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions at his words: pride at having saved her fellow soldiers, guilt about taking lives, confusion about her role and identity, and relief that they had all survived the ambush. The person she had been that morning seemed like a stranger now, someone naive about the realities of combat and the impossible choices that war sometimes demanded. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached as the helicopters landed and reinforcement troops secured the area. "Chen, I need to debrief you about what happened here. Command is going to want a full report." "I understand, Sergeant." Rodriguez studied her face carefully. "Are you okay, Doc? I mean, really okay? What you did today, that's going to stay with you for a long time." Sarah nodded slowly. "I know, Sergeant, but I'm dealing with it. Right now, I just want to focus on getting our wounded taken care of." Over the next several hours, Sarah helped evacuate the casualties and provided detailed medical reports to the incoming medical team. The official after-action report would document that the patrol had been ambushed by superior numbers, but had successfully defended themselves with no fatalities and only minor casualties. The report would note that effective suppression of an enemy machine gun position had been crucial to the successful defense. What the report wouldn't capture was the personal transformation that had occurred for one young medic who had learned that the line between healing and fighting was sometimes thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Later that evening, back at Forward Operating Base Thunder, Sarah sat alone in the medical facility, cleaning and organizing equipment. Captain Williams found her there, working methodically through routine tasks that didn't require much thought. "Chen, you should be resting," he said gently. "You've had a hell of a day." "I'm fine, sir. Just wanted to make sure everything was ready in case we get more casualties." Captain Williams pulled up a chair and sat down across from her. "I've been a military doctor for 15 years, Chen. I've seen a lot of medics deal with their first real combat situation. You did good today, but I know it wasn't easy." Sarah stopped organizing supplies and looked at him. "Sir, I killed people today. That's not what medics are supposed to do." "No, it's not," Captain Williams agreed. "Under normal circumstances, we focus entirely on healing and let others handle the fighting. But these weren't normal circumstances. You were in a life-or-death situation where traditional roles didn't apply." "I keep thinking about that wounded Taliban fighter," Sarah said quietly. "He was reaching for a weapon, so I had to stop him. But he was also wounded and in pain. And every instinct I have as a medic said I should have been treating him, not shooting him." Captain Williams nodded, understanding. "That's the contradiction that every combat medic has to live with. We're trained to save lives, but we're also soldiers in a war zone. Sometimes those two roles conflict in ways that are impossible to resolve cleanly." Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking about the events of the day. "The thing is, sir, I don't regret what I did. If I hadn't neutralized that machine gun position, Johnson would be dead right now. Martinez would be dead. Maybe all of us would be dead. I saved lives today by taking lives." "That's a mature way to look at it, Chen, and it's probably the healthiest perspective you can have. You made a terrible choice in an impossible situation, and you made it for the right reasons." Over the following weeks, Sarah continued her duties as a combat medic, but she noticed that something fundamental had changed in how others saw her and how she saw herself. The other soldiers treated her with a new level of respect that went beyond her medical skills. They knew she had proven herself in combat, that she was willing to fight alongside them when necessary. Word of what had happened at Shinwar village spread throughout the base, and Sarah found herself dealing with a reputation she had never sought. Some people called her a hero for saving the patrol. Others questioned whether a medic should have abandoned her medical role to engage in combat. Sarah herself wasn't sure which perspective was correct. Captain Williams recommended her for a Bronze Star Medal for valor in combat, writing in his recommendation that Corporal Chen displayed exceptional courage and tactical judgment in neutralizing an enemy position that threatened the survival of her entire unit. Her actions directly saved multiple American lives and demonstrated the highest traditions of military service. The medal ceremony was held at the base 6 weeks later, with representatives from higher command flying in to present the award. As Sarah stood at attention while the citation was read, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had joined the military to save lives, and she was being decorated for taking them, but she had also saved lives that day. Private Johnson made a full recovery and returned to duty. Martinez healed completely from his shrapnel wounds. Every member of the patrol had gone home to their families because of the choice she had made in that dusty building in Shinwar village. After the ceremony, Sarah called her mother from the base phone center. She couldn't tell her family the specific details of what had happened due to operational security requirements, but she could share some of her feelings about her evolving role as a soldier and medic. "Mom, I'm learning that things here are more complicated than I expected when I enlisted," she said carefully. "Are you okay, sweetheart? You sound different somehow." Sarah smiled sadly. "I'm fine, Mom. I'm just growing up, I guess. Learning that sometimes there aren't easy answers to difficult questions. Your grandmother would be proud of you. Sarah, whatever you're dealing with over there, I know you're doing the right thing." After she hung up the phone, Sarah walked outside and looked up at the stars visible in the clear Afghan sky. She thought about her grandmother, about the promise she had made at the funeral, about the wounded Taliban fighter, about Private Johnson recovering in a hospital in Germany. She was still a medic. She still believed in saving lives and treating the wounded, but she was also a soldier who understood that sometimes, in order to save some lives, you had to be willing to take others. It wasn't a contradiction she could resolve, but it was a reality she could live with. The war would continue, and there would be more patrols, more casualties, more impossible choices. But Sarah Chen had learned something important about herself and about the nature of service in combat. Sometimes the line between healing and fighting disappeared entirely, and when it did, you had to be ready to do whatever was necessary to protect the people depending on you. She was no longer the naive young woman who had believed that medics don't fight. She was a combat veteran who understood that in war, everyone fights in their own way, and sometimes the person holding the medical supplies has to be the same person pulling the trigger. That night, Sarah Chen slept peacefully for the first time since the ambush, knowing that she had found a way to be both a healer and a warrior when circumstances demanded it.